All right, let's go to the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers. And we're not going to get very far today, but that's no surprise to anybody. We might actually finish this sheet. I figure instead of doing 2 or 3 pages, we'll just do the 1 page. And then... But anyway, the book of Numbers. And we're going to go to a couple other portions of Scripture before we actually get into the beginning of Numbers here. But if you notice, that is an unusual name to give to a book of the Bible, Numbers. And really, if you're like me, or at least the way I used to be, you come to some of these books and you see numbers. Now, I'm not a math guy. You don't want me doing math. It's just, if you bring somebody to me and say, can you teach them math? Well, you're going to destroy the person, is what you're doing. But numbers do not appeal to me. So this is kind of one of those books. They have a lot of names, a lot of numbers, and just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It is kind of a different book, but it is a very rich book. But you notice there in the blue box, what is your name? And let's just kind of understand where the name comes from for a moment. And this will kind of help us be a segue for us to get into the beginning of the book. So the Hebrew Bible, the books are named for the first sentence in the book. So, for instance, the book of Genesis is not the word Genesis referring to the beginning of something. So in the Hebrew Bible, it is in the beginning is what they call the book of Genesis. And if you look here in Numbers chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. That the title in the Hebrew Bible is Bimidbar, which means in the wilderness. This is what they call it. But you'll notice we don't have that name in our Bible. It's not called in the wilderness in ours. It's called Numbers. But in the wilderness is actually a fitting title because the book does deal with the account of Israel's travel in the wilderness. We're going to look at essentially, the book of Numbers records the 40 years wandering, journeying through the wilderness. We'll talk about this more next week, but it should have only taken 11 days for Israel to enter the promised land. But it's kind of like some people do with college. They take a really short period of time and extend it out. And they went from 11 days to 40 years. So somebody was not doing their math very well there. But it was supposed to have been 11 days, but 40 years they wandered in the wilderness. Now, the name Numbers in our English Bible actually comes from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the New Testament, or the Old Testament. And in the Septuagint, it's called arithmoi. And in Latin, it's called numeri. And the reason it has this, if you notice there in the first paragraph, the name Numbers is taken from the 2 numberings, that's your blank, the word 2, numberings of the people of Israel. The first numbering of the people of Israel comes in chapter 1 at the base of Mount Sinai, and that is of the Exodus generation. So of the people that came out of Egypt in the Exodus, they number them. And so that's the first numbering in chapter 1. The second time the children of Israel are numbered is in chapter 26. But that is of the second generation, because during that process of 40 years, that Exodus generation, all of them except for Joshua and Caleb and the children that came out, they're all going to die. All the grown-ups from that generation are going to die. And so that second generation, that's now upwards of their 40s or 50s by this time, they are going to be numbered in that second numbering of the children of Israel in chapter 26. Now, Numbers follows the nation of Israel through the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years. And this period of wandering is due to their disobedience and unbelief in Kadesh Barnea. As a result, the entire generation except Joshua and Caleb perished during these 40 years in the wilderness. From their wilderness wanderings, they slowly learned a lesson that there are consequences for their actions. Whether those actions are good or bad, for or against God, there is always consequences for our actions. I think that's one of the laws of thermodynamics. Every action has an equal or greater reaction. There's always a consequence. Now Moses, that's your next blank. Moses wrote the book of Numbers when, and sorry, that Numbers should be capitalized, but it was when he's in Moab with the children of Israel. So at the end of this near the end of this 40 years, Moses and the children of Israel are in Moab, getting ready to cross over. And actually then when we get into Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is basically Moses' last words to the nation of Israel. And basically it's a record of a revival meeting. He preaches 5 sermons to the nation of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, and that's what Deuteronomy is. And that takes place in the same area where he's at when he writes Numbers. And so, at the end of his life, the theme of this book is the disciplining. The disciplining. And just in case you're like me, disciplining. Disciplining of God's own because of their unbelief and disobedience. Does God chasten us when we're disobedient and unbelief? Absolutely he does. Hebrews chapter 12 tells us that. What son is he whom the Father chastens not? He scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. Why does he do that? Why do we discipline? You see, now, we're human, and all of us at one point or another, we've disciplined more as a punishment just because we're angry. But what is the purpose? It's to reach that goal. What is it? What is the expectation? What do we want from our kids when they grow up, get out of the house? That's what our discipline is supposed to be in line with. We're molding them into that by our discipline. That's exactly what God does to us. And when we get out of the way, we need to be corrected and taught again. Now, it's interesting that this period of time is stricken from the Hall of Faith. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Keep your place in Numbers. You're going to want to put a bookmark there. But go to Hebrews chapter 11. It's interesting to see how Paul does this because he skips over this entire period of time. Hebrews chapter 11. And notice verse 29. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea, as by dry land, which the Egyptians essaying to do were drowned. What is that? That's the Exodus. And then notice verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. Skips the entire 40 years. Goes right from the Exodus to the entering of the Promised Land. Why is that? It's because this entire period of time records the time in which the people were in unbelief. That's your last blank there. The people were in unbelief. So obviously it couldn't be written into the Hall of Faith, could it? But it's interesting how the Lord identifies that for us. But all was not lost. As a result, lessons are learned during these 40 years in the wilderness. The nation was purified. The nation was purified by the weeding out of the rebellious generation. The nation that was made up of ex-slaves is now molded by God into a nation ready to obey and enter the promised land. So God wasn't done with them. God was still working on the nation of Israel. Now, Leviticus dealt with Israel's worship. But now the book of Numbers is going to deal with the nation as pilgrims. It's going to deal with their pilgrimage and their walk with God. Notice, if you would, 1 Peter, hopefully you're in Hebrews, but 1 Peter chapter 2. Notice what Peter tells us. And this really is where a lot of the difficulty was with the nation of Israel. This is where a lot of our difficulty is in the Christian life. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, Peter tells these Jews that he's writing to, dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. As believers, we're pilgrims. You know, I'm sure most of us have sung the song, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. But we really don't live that way, do we? Boy, we put a tight grip on this world. And that's why we're worried about dying. That's why we get so frustrated when things go wrong. I'm just as guilty as anybody, but when things don't go our way, we get angry and upset. Why? It's because we're making this world home. We're dealing with this issue of trials and struggles and temptations and stuff like that on Sunday mornings. You know what is wonderful about trials and tribulations? They remind us that we're not at home. And we need that reminder. When I go home at the end of the day, I walk in the door, I do not expect to get beaten up. Wrestled with maybe, but not beaten up. Why? Because it's my home. I belong there. But in this world, we don't belong. Jesus has called us out of the world. We don't belong here. Everything that we have in this world, we should hold on to with open hands, because we don't belong here. This is just a temporary dwelling. We're just kind of camping out on our way home is all that we're doing here. And this is something that the children of Israel do eventually learn as they're in the wilderness. In chapter 25, while they're in Moab, we're introduced to this issue of the doctrine of Balaam. And what did Balaam do? He taught Balak to cast, we're told in Revelation, taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel. And what was that? To eat things sacrificed unto idols and to commit fornication. So Balak wanted Balaam to curse the children of Israel, but he found out that he couldn't curse what God has blessed. And so what he does is he teaches Balak, okay, I can't curse them, but this is what you can do. You get your women to line up beside the road, get them to come out and constantly appeal to the men of the nation of Israel, and they'll go for the women. And then God will have to destroy them. And that's exactly what happens in chapter 25. They get so caught up in the world, and they so get tied down to the people around them, that God ends up having to judge them as a result of that. So it is a lesson that they did learn. Now we get into the wilderness wanderings. Let's go to Numbers chapter 1. Well, actually, no, stop right there. Before we get into that, let's look at this box here. What is that to me? We read the Old Testament, or I hope you read the Old Testament, but sometimes we get reading through there and why in the world did God give this to us? Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and just look at this real quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. First Corinthians 10:1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant. About what? He doesn't want us to be ignorant about what? How that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Now it's really interesting. He's referring to events that take place in their wilderness wanderings. They come through the Red Sea, and then they're in the wilderness. But notice verse 5. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and to drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication. You see what Paul is doing here is he's taking the examples. He's taking from these, how we often look at stories, these historical accounts. He's taking from this example, and he's saying, this is the lesson we're supposed to learn. Don't lust after evil things. Don't be idolaters. Verse 8, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day, 320,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now notice what he says, verse 11. Now, all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for who? Our admonition. upon whom the ends of the world are come. Now, the ends of the world, there, the word world refers to the age. This is the last age. That time between Christ's first and second coming. Everything that's recorded for us in the Old Testament that God has preserved. Did you know that God didn't write the book of Exodus for the people of Israel, necessarily? Or just for them? Why? Because they were there. He wrote it for those afterwards. It was written, Paul says it was written for us. For this last generation. Why? So that we could learn from their example. So when we're reading the Old Testament, we're not supposed to read it as though it's just good literature. We're actually supposed to learn something from it. We're supposed to see the example, how God dealt with the people based upon what they did, how God carried out His law and His judgment, and we learn a great deal about God and His thoughts on things. This is how we're supposed to approach the Old Testament. There is a lesson for us. There are things that we're supposed to learn and apply. And so this is some of the this is actually why we're not going to get very far in Numbers, because we're going to kind of look back and forth between the Old and New Testament here to see some of these things. But let's go to Numbers now, chapter 1. Numbers chapter 1. We get it figured out yet? Still not. You pray for the sound system. The demons are there. And Wade and Alex haven't been doing anything with it, but the lesser demons are there. I'm kidding. The demons are always in the sound system, it seems like. But Numbers chapter 1, let's notice these first 4 verses here. And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation, on the first day of the second month, in the second year. Now notice when this is. So this is in the second year. So they have been at the base of Mount Sinai for over a year. We're in the second year now. They've been there. Second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers, with the number of their names, every male by their polls. From 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel, thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies. And with you there shall be a man of every tribe, every one head of the house of his father. So chapters 1 through 10 describe the preparations for departure from Sinai. They're getting ready now to march away from Sinai and march to the promised land. And so the book focuses on the record of Israel's travels in the desert. And from Sinai to the encampment of the second generation of Moab on the east side of the Jordan River, and they are ready for battle. And this is important. Now notice here, it is important to note that when they do the counts, notice here verse 3, who they're counting. They're not counting every person. Notice verse 3. It says, from 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to what? War in Israel. So that's your blank. They are only counting the men of war, not every individual that's living. This further establishes the theme, we talked about this in Genesis, that Israel is God's army. Israel is God's army. Remember in Genesis 15, when the Lord is putting in place the Abrahamic covenant, He tells Abraham, your descendants are going to go into a foreign land. They're going to be there for 400 years. And the fourth generation, they're going to come out. But why are they going to be there? They're going to be there during that time because, he says, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Who are the Amorites? They're the people that are in the land that God's going to take them to. Because they were not yet as wicked as what they were going to become. And so when God delivers them from Egypt and brings them out, He is bringing them out as His army, as an instrument of judgment against those people who were usurping the land that He had promised to Abraham. So they are coming out as His army. Now, the numbering of the fighting men, of these men of war, and the chapters go on to describe, chapters 1, 2, and 3 go on to describe their placement around the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. And that was for military purposes. That was to protect the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. Because the tabernacle is a symbol of Israel's separation to God, separation from the world, and they're being set apart, and I think I spelled that wrong, being set apart to God as His chosen nation. Now, you'll notice there's a diagram of the tabernacle and the placement of the tribes. Now, I'm going to give you some numbers to write down. Okay? I'm going to give you some numbers here to write down. You see there across the top, you have Dan, Asher, Naphtali. Those are the tribes. Let me give you the numbers of the men of war. Now, this is going to become important, not so much this week, but probably next week we're going to look at this, and there's some really interesting things to notice from this that we're going to see next week. So, Dan, there was 62,700 that were the men of war. 62,700. That's 62700. For Asher, there was 41,500. 41,500. For Naphtali, there was 53,400. 53,400. Everybody get those? Anybody need me to repeat? Okay. Now we're going to go down the right side with Judah. Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Judah, there was 74,600. 74,600. Issachar was 54,400. 54,400. Zebulun was 57,400. 57,400. Now we're going to go across the bottom. We're going to go from left to right, Gad, Simeon, Reuben. So starting with Gad, it's 45,650. 45,650. Simeon is 59,300. 59,300. Reuben is 46,500. 46,500. Then we're going to go over to the left side, starting from top to bottom with Benjamin down to Ephraim. Benjamin was 35,400. 35,400. Manasseh is 32,200. 32,200, and then Ephraim is 40,500. 40,500. And there's a lot of really interesting symbolism that's there. We'll look at that next week. But now, going into chapters 5 through 10, they record the first priestly instructions, and they describe the necessary inward conditions, that's your blank, inward conditions of the camp. And it's interesting to go through these and to identify these, because these are the exact same things that we're told in the New Testament. There are parallels to this in the New Testament. So the first, your first blank is purity. The first inward condition they were to have is purity. Let's look at chapter 5. And you're going to want to keep your fingers ready, because we're going to go back and forth to the New Testament and the Old Testament. Notice chapter 5, verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel, that they put out of the camp every leper, and every one that hath an issue, and whosoever is defiled by the dead, both male and female shall ye put out. Without the camp shall ye put them, that they defile not their camps in the midst whereof I dwell. And the children of Israel did so, and put them out without the camp, as the Lord spake unto Moses, so did the children of Israel. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, okay, so we'll get into that in just a moment, I think. But here they're told to put out anybody that would defile the camp. Anybody that would defile the camp of Israel. They're to remove the lepers. Why? Because a leper is a picture of a sinner. somebody who is without Christ. Any person that would defile. Now, does God tell us to do that in the New Testament? Let's keep your place here. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. We're going to be in 1 and 2 Corinthians several times here. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Is God concerned still in the New Testament about the defilement of his people and where and when we meet? Absolutely he is. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, notice this. Verse number 16 says, Know ye not that ye are the temple of God? And who's that? That's the church. Ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you. Now notice what he says in verse 17. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. So is God concerned about the defilement of his people? Absolutely he is. Just as he was in the Old Testament. So what are we supposed to do? Well, notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 13. But them that are without God judgeth, therefore put away from among yourselves that wicked person. Are we supposed to put people out of the church that could defile the church? Yes. Absolutely we are. Without hesitation. Why? Because God is more concerned about the purity of his people than he is about the emotions of others. Did you know that? See, we get way too concerned about what other people think and feel. And we're more concerned about what they think and feel than what God thinks about something. And we can't be that way. We have to take into consideration and obey God first. That just needs to be the priority. I'm sure those people in the Old Testament that had leprosy, is it their fault that they have leprosy? No. But what does God say? Put them out of the camp. And if they have an issue of blood, what are you supposed to do? Is it their fault? No. But what are you supposed to do? You put them out of the camp. Well, what if they were defiled by a dead body? They're walking down the road with somebody, the guy has a heart attack, falls over and dies and bumps into them. Ceremonially, they're unclean. They've been defiled by a dead body. Is that their fault? No. But God wasn't concerned about their fault or not. He was concerned about the purity and the cleanliness of his people. And the rest of the can. Now let's go back. So the first one's purity. The second one is separation. Let's notice here in chapter 6. And this gets into the vow of the Nazarite. But notice this. Chapter 6, verse 1. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speaking to the children of Israel, and saying to them, when either man or woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow of a Nazarite. Now, this is Nazarite, not Nazareth, okay? Jesus was a Nazarene because he was from Nazareth. He was not a Nazarite. Okay, that's important to keep in mind. But notice what this vow of the Nazarite was. To separate themselves unto the Lord. He shall separate himself from wine and strong drink, and shall drink no vinegar of wine, or vinegar of strong drink. Neither shall he drink any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes, or dried. All the days of his separation shall he eat nothing that is made of the vine tree, from the kernels even to the husk. Verse 5, all the days of the vow of his separation, there shall no razor come upon his head, until the days be fulfilled, in the which he separateth himself unto the Lord. He shall be holy, and shall let the locks of the hair of his head grow. All the days that he separateth himself unto the Lord, he shall come at no dead body. He shall not make himself unclean for his father, or for his mother, or for his brother, or for his sister. So that means if they die, he's not allowed to touch them. He's not allowed to go in and take the body out of the house or anything like that. He can't do anything with the body. Because the consecration of his God is upon his head. All the days of his separation, he is holy unto the Lord. Now let's look at the New Testament. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and look at this. Does God teach us to be holy? Is there a parallel to this vow of the Nazarite? Well, we don't have these type of vows necessarily binding upon us in the New Testament. Does God want us holy? Are we supposed to be holy and separated unto him? Absolutely. It's interesting that Samuel and John the Baptist were separated with the vow of the Nazarite from their mother's womb. All the way to the day of their death, they had this vow.
We're supposed to be separated. From the time we get born again until the time we go home to heaven, we are supposed to be separated. Now look here, 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Let me get there too. But notice what he says here. Verse number 14, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement, now notice this, what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore, come out from among them. Who's the them? The unbelievers, the idols, the infidel. Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. And notice this is interesting, because we're using the exact same concepts here as the vow of the Nazarite, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty, having therefore these promises, dearly beloved. What promises? Everything that he just mentions from the Old Testament. Everything that he's mentioned from verse 14 to verse 18, he's quoting from the Old Testament. And so he says, having these promises, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Isn't that interesting? So he's taken this concept of separation, and he's applying it to us in the New Testament. So we're going back and forth here because I want us to make sure that we have this type of an understanding. When we're reading through the Old Testament, we need to be looking for these things. We're not just reading it, casually reading over it, just thinking, oh, this is great history. This has something for us. It was written, Paul says, for us. It was written to be applied to our lives. Now notice the next thing here, back in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So as the children of Israel is going, they're to be pure. They're to be separate. They are to bear God's name. That's your next blank. They're to bear God's name. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 22. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto Aaron and unto his sons, saying, on this wise ye shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. Now notice this, verse 27. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. What does that mean for them to bear his name, to have his name put upon them? Let's go to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy 28, verse 9. Deuteronomy 28, 9. The Lord shall establish thee an holy people unto himself, as he hath sworn unto thee. If thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, and walk in his ways, and all the people of the earth shall see that thou art called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of thee. How are the people, how is God's name upon the people of Israel? How are they called by the name of the Lord? Because they keep his commandments. So this means that they were to live in such a way as to show that they were, in fact, the people of God. Now, does the New Testament teach us something about that? Let's go to Colossians. New Testament, Colossians. It's Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians chapter 3. Verse 17. I guess if I got over to Colossians. Philippians 3:17 is a good verse too, but it's not quite there. Verse 17, whatsoever ye do in word or deed, do all in what? The name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God and the Father by him. Do people see our actions and know that we are God's people? Would they look at us and say, you must be a Christian, because you're different. That's exactly what he tells the children of Israel. He says, by you keeping my commandments, the people of the nations around you will see that obedience, and they will call you by my name. So as the children of Israel go in their journeys, they are supposed to go pure. They are supposed to be separate. They're supposed to bear God's name. And notice here in chapter 7 and 8 of Numbers, they are to have holy leaders. That's your next blank. Holy leaders. And now, obviously, we're not going to take time to read all of chapter 7 and 8. But these chapters describe the sanctifying of the leaders of the tribes and of those who are going to minister in the tabernacle. Do we have that in the New Testament? Are the leaders in the New Testament supposed to be holy people? Well, 1 Timothy chapter 3 certainly seems to indicate that they are. They have very high standards for those who are going to be the bishops and deacons of the church. Very high standards. Actually, they're supposed to be the epitome of the Christian life. No pressure. Actually, real quick, before we get into this, we're going to look at a portion in Numbers chapter 8, but I want you to look over at the book of Titus. Because it's not just the religious leaders. It's all the leaders are supposed to be holy. And notice in Titus chapter 2, Titus addresses this as well. Titus chapter 2, verse 2 speaks of the aged men, that they be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in charity, in patience. What's he speaking of? Their character, their conduct. The aged men in the church. And then he speaks of the aged women likewise, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may, now notice this, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children. So the aged women, not only are they supposed to have holy lives, but they're supposed to be teaching the next generation how to be a woman. That doesn't happen too often. Do you know that? And oftentimes it doesn't even happen in the home. But notice what he says, to teach the women to be, verse 5, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Now notice verse 6, young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded. Who's supposed to be teaching the young men? The aged men. In all things, what are they supposed to teach these young men? Verse 7, in all things showing thyself a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity, sound in speech, that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you. He speaks of exhorting servants to obedience to their masters. He speaks... verse 10 there, not purloining but showing all good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. So what's supposed to happen? The leaders are supposed to be holy people. Both those who minister and those who are just the leaders of the camp. They're supposed to be holy. For what purpose? To teach the next generation. They're supposed to be showing the next generation. Now notice here in chapter 8 of Numbers, there's a very interesting note regarding the priests. I thought this was kind of fascinating, and there are some preachers that I think could learn from this principle. There was a generation, and there's some still remnants of it, that had this idea that if I'm going into the ministry, I'm going to be there till I die. And so you get men like Bob Jones Sr. who get up into the pulpit and they can't, with Alzheimer's, and they can't remember
what's been going on. All they can do is keep repeating their testimony about when they got saved, because it's the only thing that they can remember. But notice what goes on here. Numbers chapter 8, verse 23. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, This is it that belongeth unto the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall go in and wait upon the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. So, they can begin their ministry at 25 years old. And from 25 and upward, they go into the ministry. And notice verse 25. And from the age of 50 years, they shall cease waiting upon the service thereof, and shall serve no more, but shall minister with their brethren in the tabernacle of the congregation, to keep the charge, and shall do no service. Now that's a really interesting note. There's a really interesting principle there. That they can go into the ministry, but there comes a point where they need to step aside and stop. And teach the next generation how to do the work that they did. You know, it's interesting. He doesn't tell them to stop and just leave, but they're to prepare the next leaders. This is really the way it's supposed to be. This is what we see in the New Testament. You know, one of the things that's interesting in the New Testament is you find in the church that the leaders are producing more leaders. And this is one of the burdens that I have. It's a regular thing on my prayer list to be praying for leaders. Because the ministry was never intended by God to be done alone. We've grown up in this thing where, you know, a one pastor model, but that's a very recent development in history. Everywhere you see elders in the New Testament, leaders in the church, it's always in the plural. Always. Every time. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a requirement. I don't see any clear command, but you certainly see the example. There's never a church without more than one elder. Why is that? Because ministry is not based upon one person. Ministries so oftentimes get based upon one person, where the pastor does all the work, people get attached to him, and then when he dies and the church or leaves, the church is without any type of leadership. Are the sheep supposed to find their own shepherd? Or should a shepherd help them find a replacement? See, these are the things that happen. And one of the reasons the New Testament has a plurality of leadership within it is so that way if something happens to one of them, there's somebody else there. And this is exactly what's going on here. The older generation has a point where they stop ministering and they start working in that next generation into their service. They're not completely done with their work, but they're done with the main part of the ministry, and they are helping and teaching the next generation to do that work that they were doing. That is God's plan. That is something you see over and over throughout the New Testament. It is a very clear principle. Now let's look at this next thing. In chapter 9, let's go over there, Numbers chapter 9. They're to keep the Passover. That's your next blank, Passover. Keeping the Passover. So, they're supposed to be pure, separate, bear God's name, have holy leaders, and they're to be keeping the Passover. Numbers chapter 9. Let's notice verse number 1 here. Very interesting situation. Numbers chapter 1. The Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month, in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt. So, now they are going to celebrate the Passover after over a year's time coming out of Egypt. Verse 2, let the children of Israel also keep the Passover at his appointed season. In the 14th day of this month at even, ye shall keep it in his appointed season. According to all the rites of it, and according to all the ceremonies thereof shall ye keep it. And Moses spake unto the children of Israel, that they should keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at even in the wilderness of Sinai. According to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so did the children of Israel.
And there were, now notice this, verse 6, and there were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man, that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And those men said unto him, We are defiled by the dead body of a man. Wherefore are we kept back, or why are we kept back, that we may not offer an offering of the Lord in his appointed season among the children of Israel? And Moses said unto them, Stand still, and I will hear what the Lord will command concerning you. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a man of you or of your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey afar off, yet he shall keep the Passover unto the Lord. Now notice this, verse 11. The 14th day of the second month at even they shall keep it, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any bone of it. According to all the ordinances of the Passover, they shall keep it. But the man that is clean and is not in a journey, and forbeareth to keep the Passover, or he just won't do it, even the same soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he brought not the offering of the Lord in his appointed season. That man shall bear his sin. And if a stranger shall sojourn among you, and will keep the Passover unto the Lord, according to the ordinances of the Passover, and according to the manner thereof, so shall he do. Ye shall have one ordinance, both for the stranger and for him that was born in the land. Now this is interesting. So the children of Israel are to keep the Passover. So this first observance of the Passover by the nation is in the second year after the Exodus. And we notice there who was not to partake of it, those who were defiled. So, first month, 14th day of the month is the Passover. But what if you're defiled? What if, for some reason, you're on a journey somewhere during that period of time and you can't make it back to Israel in time? Then what? Well, the Lord graciously provided that in the second month, you can have the Passover again. And those people who were defiled the first month and those people who were on a journey, they could take. Now let's look at a couple of New Testament parallels on this. So those who were defiled, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Those who were defiled could not partake of the Passover. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now we know that the Lord's Supper is not the Passover. It's only one part of the Passover. But the Lord took part of that Passover and used it to give to us the Lord's Supper. But let's notice this here. We find these exact same principles for us in the New Testament regarding the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, in verse number 11. Well, actually, that's verse 7 first. He's speaking of getting rid of those who are defiled, putting them out of the church. Purge out, therefore, the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. So he goes on to give some further details or restrictions regarding this partaking of the Lord's table, down to verse number 11. But now I have written unto you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, with such an one, no, not to eat. For what have I to do to judge them that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within? Them that are without God judgeth. Therefore put away from among yourselves that wicked person. Why were they to put him out? Because he's defiled. He's defiling the church by his presence there, and therefore, before the Lord's Supper was to be partaken of, they were to be purged out and moved out because they were not allowed to partake of it. If we go over to chapter 11, we see him speaking on this again. We're almost finished here. But chapter 11, verse number 28. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. Wherefore, my brethren, when ye come together to eat, tarry one for another. And if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that ye come not together unto condemnation. The rest will I set in order when I come. So there were those people who were to be excluded. Those who could not partake of it worthily, they were to be excluded. But then provision was made for those people who were defiled and could not partake of the Passover in the first month, the 14th day of the month. On the second month, the 14th day of the month, they could then partake of the Passover. And so they would have kind of their own Passover celebration at the tabernacle. And we see that a wonderful picture in the New Testament of God's restoration of sinning brothers who have repented, and they may return to the Lord's table. So 1 Corinthians chapter 5, they're to put this man out of the church who's defiling the church. But now notice in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. This man, after he has been put out of the church, has repented and is coming back. And notice what it says, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse number 5. But if any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, that I may not overcharge you all. Notice verse 6, sufficient to such a man is this punishment, which was inflicted of many. What's he speaking? He's speaking of the church putting this person out. The man was afflicted. It's accomplished its purpose in causing him to repent. And now notice verse 7. So that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. So once he's been cleansed, now he can come and he can partake with the church. He can once again be part of the church. But I want you to notice, go back to Numbers for a minute, Numbers chapter 9. And I want you to notice real quick the consequences for those who were not defiled and those who were not on a journey, and therefore they were there in the land. They could partake of the Passover, but they did not partake of the Passover. Notice what it says to them. Verse 13. But the man that is clean and is not in a journey and forbeareth or refuses to keep the Passover, even the same soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he brought not the offering of the Lord in his appointed season. That man shall bear his sin. Isn't that interesting? The Lord has a very high standard here. He says, if that person refuses to partake, then that person is to be put away. Now, I do think it's interesting that there's a parallel of the restoration in the New Testament. But do you think there could be a parallel in the application for the neglect? When you have people in the church that refuse to come to the Lord's table when they could, but they just don't want to. They have other things. Something for you to think about. Now notice lastly here, your last blank. So they were to be pure, separate, bear God's name, have holy leaders, keep the Passover, and then lastly, they're to be led by God in the journey and in rest. And we'll just read a few verses here from Numbers 9, and then we'll be done. Verse number 15, Numbers 9:15. And on that day, that the tabernacle was reared up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, namely the tent of the testimony. And at even there was upon the tabernacle, as it were, the appearance of fire until the morning. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, then after that the children of Israel journeyed. And in the place where the cloud abode, there the children of Israel pitched their tents. And the commandment of the Lord, the children of Israel, at the commandment of the Lord, the children of Israel journeyed, there we go. And at the commandment of the Lord, they pitched as long as the cloud abode upon the tabernacle. They rested in their tents. So anytime God's presence moved, the children of Israel moved. And when God's presence stopped moving, then they pitched camp, and they stayed there, and they rested there. When God's presence would abide in a place, they put up the tabernacle, and they waited. Do we have a parallel in the New Testament? Absolutely we do. We're to walk as children of light. We're to be followers of God
as dear children, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 tells us. So, I think we see some of these parallels here, and I think we'll stop there for today. Father, thank you for the time you've given to us today in your word. Pray that you'll bless it. Lord, help us to be more like you and to be faithful, and to learn from the examples that we have in the Old Testament, and to learn how to apply them to our life. Pray that you'll bless now in Jesus' name. Amen.